This afternoon I'm going to talk a little bit about what you can do with fertilizers to reduce nitrous oxide emissions and reduce overall losses. The economics part of it, I'm going to leave to the economists for the most part, but we'll talk about on-farm practice, and I'm going to do this within the framework of something called 4R nutrient stewardship. Before we get into that, though, I should tell you a little bit about Fertilizer Canada, because they are what they are. I've been asked that question a couple of times today. So Fertilizer Canada is an industry organization that is financed by the fertilizer manufacturers, the retailers, so the fertilizer industry. One of its main purposes is to lobby on fertilizer issues in Ottawa. But then some of the other things it does is on the side of industry safety, and a big emphasis the last 15 years has been on what we would call fertilizer sustainability. So they're the vehicle through which the fertilizer industry in Canada has largely tried to improve and position fertilizer within this idea of sustainable agriculture. So one of the things they've done, for example, is they have a fund that they use for research. So they've invested about $3 million into fertilizer research across the prairies in the sustainability area over the last 6 years, and some of that money's been matched by money from the federal government, by money from some of the provincial governments, from some other organizations. So they've got, I would say, they've been able to take that money and lever it. So some of the things I'll be talking about today, in terms of some of the research that's gone on, has been funded by Fertilizer Canada. They also they have a fairly large extension program to get the message out about how to improve fertilizer management, both to the retailers and to farmers. So the vehicle for which they've been doing that through is something called 4R nutrient stewardship. And 4R nutrient stewardship uses this concept of the right rate at the right source at the right rate, the right time, and the right place. If you make those decisions in ways that will improve the efficiency of the fertilizer, you can not only get more bang for your fertilizer dollar, but you can reduce some of the issues with fertilizer when it gets off the field and into either the air or the water. And you can also then, it's also a vehicle for demonstrating to the off-farm community that retailers and farmers are using fertilizer in responsible ways. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, 4R nutrient stewardship is actually a Saskatchewan invention, and it actually started right here in Saskatoon at the University of Saskatchewan. And John Stewart, who used to teach there, one of his students, Terry Roberts, back in the 80s, went on to become the head of the International Plant Nutrition Institute. And Terry took the notes from John's fertility course and started to build them out into this idea of source rate, time, place, and 4R nutrient stewardship. And it's become now, it's used all over the globe. So it's been, it's got a lot of traction in the US. It's gaining traction in Canada, where it was first developed. It's into Europe, starting to be seen in South America, Australia, so everywhere. So right here from Saskatchewan, then, that's built out into a global movement to improve fertilizer use. So some of the questions I'm going to try and answer today are: what sources reduce nitrogen emissions? How important is rate in determining emissions? Does time of application affect emissions? Does placement affect emissions? And can I measure and monetize these on my farm, these reductions in emissions or improvements? So I'm going to touch on all of those in 25 minutes. It's a very complex issue, so I won't get to everything. But I will, I think, give you a bit of insight into each of those things. So for any questions I don't answer today, or if you want more information on this, Fertilizer Canada has spent quite a bit of effort putting material together so that farmers and retailers can educate themselves, and that's in their e-learning center. So if you just Google Fertilizer Canada e-learning, you'll get to their e-learning site, and there's a number of courses in there that will go through source rate, time, place practices. There's some about greenhouse gases, general losses. There's a Saskatchewan specific one. So quite a bit of information to work through. You can work through it in the, between periods in the hockey game on your tablet. The only issue with some of them is I actually narrated some of them, so you'd have to listen to my voice again, but otherwise they're good stuff. So you heard mention a little earlier about this crisis of food production and raising population. So one of the things that comes out of that is that there's no new land, or no new land that we can really productively put into production without losing a bunch of the other benefits we get from that land in its more natural state. But the Food and Agriculture Organization has this thing that they call climate smart agriculture, which deals, or kind of looks at what the general strategies are for agriculture to meet this food demand. And so, you have to improve the management per acre, by encouraging higher intensity or higher output per acre. Promote conservation agriculture, so things like keeping grassland as grassland so that it doesn't blow off a lot of carbon by keeping farmers, making it worth their while to stay in conservation tillage. The economic viability of the farm is paramount to that. You can't ask farmers to do things that would put their farm in economic disarray. And then, at the same time, produce sufficient food. And so 4R meets all of these criteria in that area of nutrient management, and reduces emission, is a way to reduce emissions per unit of crop production. We had at my table I was sitting at just before, during coffee, and I've heard a lot about this, about emission intensity versus the total emission picture. And greenhouse gas, or the warming is driven by total emission. So when you talk to environmentalists, they say, well, emission intensity, we don't really care about that. It's total emissions, right? That's important. And they're right in that sense. The higher the total emissions, the more carbon in the atmosphere, or carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases, the higher the temperature rise is going to be. But agriculture is in kind of a special place, because agriculture, we provide, or at least at the moment with current technology, we provide a good that can't be replaced, and people have to eat. So, we have a little more grace in terms of our total emissions if we are showing that we're reducing our intensities. And that's just in a general, the general political sphere. So most everybody's talked about this. Just a reminder that when we're talking about, I'm going to talk about nitrogen management in annual crops. I'm going to kind of keep it fairly specific this afternoon. And so nitrogen management on arable land or with annual crops is, the greenhouse gas we're interested in is nitrous oxide. And a little bit goes a long way, of course. We've seen this number of 298 kilograms, or 1 kilogram of N2O is equal to 298 kilograms of carbon dioxide. That comes from the International Panel on Climate Change. I believe they have reduced that actually to 265 now, so that it's it's a little less, but still it's a big number. A kilogram goes a long way. So when we're talking, generally when we're comparing using these carbon dioxide equivalents. I think everybody in the room understands that. So I'll try to make sure when I'm talking about carbon dioxide equivalents, nitrous oxide has the equivalent amount of carbon dioxide, and when it's not, when it's just nitrous oxide. So this is a bit of a picture of Canadian agriculture, and people have thrown out numbers on where this is coming from. If you've been able to keep track, there's about 60 million tons comes out of agriculture in Canada. About 19 of that, or 18, somewhere in there, comes out of Saskatchewan, and most of that comes out of, I say most of that in Saskatchewan, as we saw, comes from fertilizer, or a good chunk of it does, the rest coming from cattle. It was interesting, because I'm going to show that same, I'll just leave that for a minute. So with nitrous oxide then, Rochette and a group of his colleagues a few years ago, they put together this map of what are the sort of the average nitrous oxide emissions regionally. And if you can see the colors on that map, if it's showing up, Saskatchewan is it's the two lowest categories. So southern Saskatchewan, you'd expect, as in the southwest where it's a little drier, it's somewhere between 0.5 kilogram of nitrous oxide nitrogen per hectare per year, and above, say in the darker brown and black and gray zones mostly, it might be up in the range of half to a kilogram a year. So, quite low. So if you do the math, you convert that nitrogen to nitrous oxide, which is a 1.57 times higher, and then do a little bit more, or do the conversion to carbon dioxide, I should say. 1 kilogram is about 469 kilograms of CO2e. So somewhere between 250 and so 1.25 a ton per hectare is coming out of agricultural soils in Saskatchewan, is by this estimate. So you've seen this data before, and then the question came up about, does that include the carbon sequestration that we've been talking about so much? And the carbon sequestration is, the carbon emissions. This is an emissions value. So, like emissions as was shown by one of the previous speakers, emissions from land use change into direct seeding and zero tillage is basically, these days, there are no emissions. So there's actually sequestration going on. So that number wouldn't include emissions, right? But it's not, I don't think, because that was your thought, but I don't think it's net of those, that sequestration. So this is emissions from cattle and fertilizer and manure application and those kinds of things. So by my sort of quick back of the napkin math, there's about 5 to 7 tons of CO2e as N2O from N fertilizer coming off the cropland in Alberta and Saskatchewan. That's the size of the emissions is somewhere in that range, and just those numbers along the right-hand side. 0.15%, that's agriculture in Saskatchewan's contribution to the global emissions. So if we take, fertilizer then, it's somewhere around 0.04% in Saskatchewan fertilizer use. And then if we say, well, maybe we can reduce that by 15%, right? Or I should say we can reduce that by about a quarter. You know, we're down to somewhere around, we're going to move the needle 0.004%. So, like, what happens in Saskatchewan is not going to save the world, obviously. So why would we do it? But Brian mentioned a couple of other things that are developing. So, you know, why we would do it is part of the global community, all that good stuff. But one of the other things that's really starting to develop is this whole value chain idea, and the value chain is interested in low carbon sources of commodities. And so I agree with Brian that in the end it's not going to be offsets that, you know, they maybe start for, and it's not even going to be regulation that kind of pushes agriculture, crop-based agriculture into lower emission practices. It's going to be things like market access, you know, being able to sell into certain markets or into certain value chains. That's a ways away, I think, probably 10 to 15 years before that gets really established. And I think I was saying it's 10 to 15 years 10 years ago. So we're not going down that road real fast, but I think that will be the ultimate driver. So Saskatchewan, there's an opportunity there. There's an opportunity by improving nitrogen management that it's somewhere, if it was widely adopted, it's somewhere between a reduction of 1 million and 2 million tons a year of greenhouse gas, CO2 equivalents, by improving nitrogen management of fertilizer. So let's just spend a minute talking about nitrous oxide emissions and nitrogen loss. And nitrous oxide emissions, they are only a little wee fraction of the nitrogen that gets lost from your fields, okay? They're highly variable in space and time. So Brian was talking about measuring carbon and how difficult that is in the field. Nitrous oxide is virtually impossible to measure at a farm level, right? You have to have highly specialized equipment. So this is all we know about nitrous oxide is basically done in very heavily monitored research plot type work. Nitrous oxide emissions are generally not economic in Saskatchewan. And by that I mean like 0.5 to 1 kilogram per hectare of loss. Like, those losses aren't really going to kill your bottom line. However, it's only a small fraction of nitrogen losses. And nitrogen losses through things like leaching and denitrification, those can be much more substantial. They contribute to what we call the indirect nitrous oxide emissions. So they end up in environments, any nitrogen that's lost from the field through other forms, it ends up in environments where it gets converted to nitrous oxide. A portion of it does, a small fraction, but it is a significant contribution overall. And nitrogen losses, like nitrous oxide emissions, are highly weather and landscape dependent, but they can be measured on the farm a little more easily. At least you can have some proxies for that, and they can have a significant economic impact. So I'm going to talk a little bit then about emissions and source, and where those emissions are coming from. So here we see a bit of the nitrogen cycle. So we get these losses through volatilization at the top. If you put like NH3 can be lost through, whether it goes down as anhydrous or from the conversion of urea. It can be lost into the environment where it's converted to nitrous oxide. At the bottom end, any nitrate that gets out through leaching or runoff, it too can be converted somewhere else to nitrous oxide. But then in the middle, like actually on farm, in your soil, in your cropping system, the two main processes are the nitrification, the conversion from an ammonium to a nitrate, and then the nitrate denitrification, the conversion of nitrate back to eventually, if it goes the entire, if the sequence plays itself completely out, it ends up as back as N2 dinitrogen. But some of that, along those processes, a fraction of that can get converted into nitrous oxide and come out as nitrous oxide. So where do the sources fit in? So we see, of course, anhydrous ammonia. If you don't get good coverage on it, don't get it, the soil's too dry, you can get some losses there. But the bigger one probably for that is urea. And so, urea and urea ammonium nitrate can contribute to that volatilization loss. They also then convert to ammonium, where you can get then this loss through the nitrification process. And they all end up as nitrate, which then is subject to losses through denitrification and or leaching. So just on the left side there, in Saskatchewan, about 20% of your nitrogen goes down as anhydrous, about 50% is urea, about 13% is UAN, about 8% is ammonium sulfate, and about 5% is MAP. So all of those can contribute to losses. So one of the things that's happened when we started working with this in about 2006, 2007, we didn't really know a whole lot about how practices impacted the nitrous oxide emissions. And so we used some proxies like how much nitrate was in the soil and things like that to start to get some ideas. But we also then spent, as a community, we spent a lot of time and effort on research to start to look into these things, and that's happened globally as well. And so this is this was actually funded by Fertilizer Canada, and Alison Eagle and a few of her colleagues, they went and they looked at a whole bunch of studies, and they used a meta-analysis, which is taking different studies that are comparable and then doing an analysis of what they say when they're kind of aggregated together. And so this is some of the things they found that for nitrous oxide, and this is intensity, so it's yield scale. But super U compared to, and this is instead of urea, you're reducing the nitrous oxide by about 30%. Coated urea instead of urea, it was more like 8 to 10%. And we can look down through this, but what we start to get is the picture that some of these enhanced efficiency products, as they're called, actually do a pretty good job of reducing nitrous oxide emissions. This is nitrous oxide emissions, so they also do a pretty good job of reducing losses, as nitrogen losses as well. And that's where the money would come in. It would be in reducing your losses. Now, the issue with this is the price benefit or the cost benefit, and I've had several discussions about that with people today. Is that until some of these source products get into the range of where the differential is less, they're not probably going to get widely accepted. So of those products, in terms of just concentrating on the nitrous oxide emissions, of those products, it's the nitrification inhibitors that seem to do the best, most consistent job. And so the ones that you have access to in your marketplace are things like DCD, which is included in Super U, which things like nitropyrin, which is in N-Trench and N-Serve, and so those are the main ones that you're going to have access to. So you can see here that they reduce emissions on average somewhere around 40%. So Dave Burton, who's a scientist who's been working in this area, he's at Dalhousie, but he's no stranger to prairie agriculture. He did his PhD out here, and then he worked at University of Manitoba for a few years before he ended up at Dalhousie. But he went right across the country and did last year did a review of this nitrous oxide emissions and fertilizer. And so these are some of the numbers he came up with, is that, nitrification inhibitors are probably reducing emissions conservatively by about 35%. If you use something with a urease inhibitor and nitrous oxide and nitrification inhibitor, it's about 25%, which is kind of surprising, but I don't really know, but that's what when you start to amalgamate the research, what it looks like. The urease inhibitors, that's the things like agrotane, right? Agrotane, they may reduce losses and put more N in the plant, but they don't. It's so variable what they do with nitrous oxide that we really don't have a handle on it at the moment. And then the polymer-coated urea probably reduces emissions around 10%. So that's Burton's summary from this review he did. Now there is a group of scientists that are working on this, and I think actually isn't Varesco kind of leading that discussion? Yeah. On how do we take all this information and turn it into numbers that we can use on the farm in something like the nitrous oxide emission reduction protocol, which I'll make a bit of mention at towards the end. So right time. So as usual, I've talked too long on the early slides. So right time, the main thing, fall versus spring is the main issue there. So the thing that we found is that after the soil cools in the fall applications on the prairies are more efficient. So we've been using this idea of 10 degrees C. So after the soil's cooled to 10 degrees, if you're putting your fertilizer nitrogen down then, you lose a lot less of it over the winter. So now that becomes something that you can start to look at in terms of fall application. In other parts of the country, like in Ontario, fall application is basically just that they don't use it because the nitrogen losses are so high that they can't stomach them. In the West, where we have colder soils and generally drier soils, fall application, late fall application can give acceptable results. So I've got to make a mention a bit about denitrification. So if you do get into a situation where you're going from your fall applied and you're going to spring, you can have substantial losses if you haven't started to use things like source and time and place practices to kind of reduce that loss and reduce that exposure. So spring flooding is one of the things that when the soil gets, this is an extreme case, but right now out there when that surface soil, there's frost in the ground, the snow's melted, that surface is saturated, you can get if there's nitrate present, you can get fairly substantial losses, and these can be from in the range of 2 to 4 pounds per acre a day, even when the soil is still fairly cold. And that can work into 15 to 30 pounds of nitrogen in a week. So it can start to get economically painful for you if you've applied a lot of N poorly in the fall. So there's an interesting thing here too, though. Nitrous oxide, when the soil's soaking wet like that, like you really get, it's really saturated and you get, there's not, the oxygen has been totally, is down to zero basically. You don't get much nitrous oxide off. The nitrous oxide comes off is when the soil is partially saturated or there's a little bit of oxygen floating around. That's when you start to see the nitrous oxide coming on. So right time, if you delay fall application, and this is early fall application of unprotected N, so just normal N sources like urea. If you delay into late in the fall and you use an inhibitor, you're going to get somewhere in the neighborhood of a 30% reduction in emissions. Switch to spring from fall compared to the worst case practice fall application of unprotected N. And again, this is from Burton. It's about a 20% emission reduction. And if you split application compared to all in at or before seeding, by split application I mean some at seeding or before seeding and some in crop, depending on the methods you use, you could get about a 15% reduction. So one of the questions that comes up then is, why don't I get more? It gets into the economics. When I use these enhanced efficiency fertilizers, why don't I get a higher yield? And the short answer to the question is because you're over-fertilizing. So, if you've already more than met, you put on your regular, a regular unprotected fertilizer, you lose some of it, but what the residual is more than meets the requirement of the crop, right? Then if you apply the same amount of enhanced efficiency fertilizer, you're going to lose less, but you're still going to be over the amount that the crop needs. So you're not going to see a benefit. So I think part of that with these enhanced efficiency fertilizers is finding out, if I'm using an enhanced efficiency fertilizer, how much can I reduce my rate? If I'm not going to get a yield bump, how much can I reduce my rate and still get the same yield? So working at it that way. So this is a bit of study from a colleague of mine, Len Krzyzanowski in Alberta, and I just want to point out this is fall banded ESN, and you can see, when we get up to the high rate of 120 kilograms per hectare, right, compared to fall banded urea, there is about a ton of grain yield difference. So in this particular situation where the yield potential was high, the crop, you got about an extra ton per acre of yield, or per hectare, I should say. So the other thing, but you can also see then fall banded urea, you can see under those kind of conditions, this is central Alberta, so black soils, wet springs, you can see how much N you actually lost in terms of how that N impacted your yield because of the loss. So would be the other way to look at it, right? Is that a higher efficiency, you lost at least a ton of yield because you lost the nitrogen. So time, spring tends to be better than fall, late fall is better than early fall. Some, as I say, you want to combine this with some source. If you can combine this with some source and placement things, it works best of all. I'm getting a little long-winded here, but we're just about done. So placement. We had an interesting conversation at my table, and it's about placement, like broadcasting. Broadcasting, which is something, during my 35-year career, broadcasting is something we kind of hammered out of farmers, right? And got them to move away from on the prairies. And now we see some of it coming back in. And so banding tends to be far more effective than broadcasting, both in terms of fertilizer use efficiency and in most cases reducing nitrous oxide emissions. And the big thing here with banding is you got to get down into the soil for it to be effective. So banding, one of the issues that started to arise in the last, with the direct seeding, is that the banding is getting shallow, right? It's only 2 to 3 centimeters below the surface, and you can start to get some losses from both emissions and losses from that through volatilization. So finally, I'll just touch on right rate. And so this is something that has been kind of a bugbear with me for 35 years. But there's an ethos. Farmers, there's a lot of bragging rights even for the guy who gets the 80 bushel canola, you know, maximum yield, fertilized for maximum yield, even though we've talked about this for decades, that maximum yield and maximum profit are not the same thing, and that by the time you put enough nitrogen down to hit maximum yield, you have passed the maximum profit point. And yet every year, you know, I'm talking to farmers, they want some insurance fertilizer down there. And sometimes it's insurance against loss, like it's as in, I'm going to lose 15%, so I'm going to put 15% more down. But sometimes it's, I'm going to put 15% more down because you know, we might get rain this year, or we might get a bit, you know, it might be that 1 year in 10 crop. And so there's this insurance idea. I did a bit of a study a couple of years ago where we looked at target yields and actual yields across the prairies, and I had some access to what farmers thought their target yields would be, and then what actual yields would be. And 80% of farmers, and this is over 3 years, 80% of farmers aimed for higher than what their actual yields ended up as. But most of them were aiming for yields that were, you know, up in it was basically their fantasy yield, or the yield they got that 1 year when everything went absolutely right. But, you know, that 80% of farmers are up in that 10th percentile, if you will, where their target yields just aren't realistic in relation to the moisture that we get and those kinds of things. So, I mean, it was a kind of a limited group of farmers, but it told me that this is an issue. So when it comes to rate and emissions, I mean, if you look at that phase 1, right, that's when the crop is taking up nitrogen effectively, and emissions are rising, but they're, you know, with nitrogen inputs, they're rising linear, you know, kind of a linear fashion. And then when you hit that point where you've kind of saturated the crop's ability to suck nitrogen out of the soil, you go into this phase 2, where you get this exponential increase in emissions. So, you know, it's not only is the extra nitrogen not doing your bottom line any good, it's being lost into the ecosystem. And it's increasing those nitrous oxide emissions. So I'm just going to finish. Like, how do we get this onto the farm? And so NIRP's been mentioned a couple of times today. So nitrous oxide emission reduction protocol developed, it was actually developed nationally. Fertilizer Canada actually paid for a lot of the development and testing of it. But it's a protocol that allows you to quantify nitrous oxide on your farm. It's practice-based. So, you know, if you're doing certain types of practices, source rate, time, place practices, what we do is there's a methodology based on your nitrogen inputs and your yields and where you're located in the country, down at the eco-district level, so things about soil type and climate, and we can kick out a number that is your nitrous oxide emissions based on your fertilizer inputs. It also accounts for crop residues, so it's a fairly complete package. It also accounts for indirect emissions as well. So it's what we call a tier 2 type approach. It's based on the national inventory method, set up for on-farm application. And it allows, it's what we've been trying to use in Alberta to get this number of emissions. And then from those emissions, based on the practices, you can say, okay, this is the general emission equation that gives us the baseline number, and then from that we can take off 15, 25, 35% based on the practices that are used, and that becomes the credit. So I'll just skip over that one, and if there's any questions, just to finish off on NIRP as well. I mean, so far in Alberta, we have actually got 0 credits through NIRP. But that I think there's been a lot of work on the protocol. There was an interesting discussion about don't adopt what we're doing in Alberta, right? And I'd say one thing about that when it comes to protocols is protocols that have been, battered and battle tested and revised and gone through that whole process are probably a lot better bet for adoption than starting over with something new, because you have to go through that whole process. And with NERP, it's taken 10 years to get it to the point now where I think we might be able to actually record some tons with it. So, any questions?
Glenn Bermuda. I just wondered if you could reconcile a couple of numbers for me. Earlier on, you were saying that a kilogram of nitrous oxide is equal to 260 kilograms of CO2, and then later on you said a kilogram of nitrous oxide per hectare is equal to 460.
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. So it's the first number is actually that we've been using is 298. So a kilogram of nitrous oxide is equal to 298 kilograms of CO2, okay? The gas, nitrous oxide, the gas, carbon dioxide, right? So 298 in terms of the global warming potential. Okay, where I was trying to unconfuse, I was trying to, my numbers were in nitrous oxide nitrogen. So that's the nitrogen in nitrous oxide. I had to convert it to nitrous oxide and then make the conversion to, because that map was in nitrous oxide. And so probably raised more confusion than I did clarity with that one.
Yes, Jonas Hagel, 502. Just a curiosity question. Is there any, which is the easiest nitrogen on the soil biology, in your opinion?
A good question. A little out of my league. Not an area I spent a lot of time in. There has been some work done in Saskatchewan that showed that anhydrous ammonia tends to have an impact on soil organic matter. Urea does as well. That's actually what I did my PhD on. But there's that, that it can be hard on the soil biology. But it's a trade-off, because really what it is, like when you take anhydrous and band it in the soil, right? What it does is anhydrous is kind of nasty stuff, right? And so what it does is it basically creates a little zone of sterility in the soil, and that's what keeps the nitrogen in the ammonium form and keeps it from converting to nitrate where it can be lost, right? So it's a trade-off between, if you wanted to protect your biology, so to speak. But the studies I have seen, I haven't seen anything that was, and that's just me, I haven't seen anything that was really convincing that, for example, biodiversity goes down substantially over time if you're an anhydrous user versus a urea user. If you want your biodiversity to go up, use manure, but we don't all have, not everybody has access to that, it's a pain, so yeah.
Jim Baker, 104. I don't know if you want to comment or not, but Iraq sells a fertilizer called Nitrous. Is that just a polymer combination of sulfur and nitrogen or urea?
Which one is it? I didn't hear the first one.
Nitrous.
Yeah. I don't know the chemistry off that one off the top of my head, but you said it's got sulfur in it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's various ways to do it. One is sulfur coating on the fertilizer, which acts like a slow release then. And then the other thing is if they include some thiourea in with the urea, it'll also slow the release as well. So I'm not sure which one that does.
Thank you.
But most of these inhibitors and slow release, they work, to a lesser or greater degree. You have to figure out which one, sort of the cost, the benefit, where it fits in. Okay, thank you.